It's okay. So yeah, we're just here to tell you a little bit about Littleborough Culvert project, which we did a couple of years ago, just as a bit of a roadmap on where we're going today. So yeah, I'm Stuart Witts. I was 10 years at Network Rail and then 11 years at Murphy's before I joined BAMS this year. So I'm kind of putting my Murphy hat back on for this one. Tony, do you want to just say hello?
Hello. No, I'm Tony Morgani. I'm a senior engineering manager with Murphy's. I was with Network Rail for about 12 years before that, and latterly 8 years with Murphy's, looking after all things track.
Great, thanks, Tony. So yeah, just a bit of a roadmap. We're just going to take you through a bit of the background and the context to it. I think this is one of these projects that, to kind of understand what's going on, you've got to kind of understand the history to it and where it came from. Take you through the key parties, and then we're going to have a little look at the design challenges and some issues with some groundwater, which proved very difficult. Tony's going to take us through some track design and track construction, which are some quite interesting highlights to that. And also he'll take us through the civils delivery on site. And then we've put a little bit of take-home learning at the end, just as some transferable learning. And as Brian says, if you've got any questions, just pop them in the chat, or if we've not explained anything as well as we could have done, we'll have another go at explaining it a little bit better. So we'll start off here. This is Rochdale Town Centre in the northwest of England. In the top right-hand corner, this is what it looks like on a nice sunny day, with the river running right through the middle of the town. The left-hand picture is what it looked like in 2015 and Boxing Day after Storm Eva. And as you can see, it's quite significant flooding there in the town centre. You can just see on the right-hand side of that left-hand picture, that's the overhead line of the Manchester Metrolink tramway system, which runs through the town. So it's damaged quite a bit of infrastructure associated with the Metrolink, as well as many, around 324 properties quite severely damaged. It's also worth noting just that thing about the 2 care homes. I was just kind of thinking about that myself. You know, you kind of think of the logistics involved and quite vulnerable adults there potentially, probably with some of them with complex medical needs. So evacuating 2 care homes is not an insignificant undertaking, and that would no doubt cause quite a bit of distress. So these events do cause a lot of disruption, and then 25,000 homes temporarily without electricity in that kind of Christmas period, which is not nice for anybody. So quite a significant event, and I think this kind of kick-started the kind of discussions as to what really needed to be done in the longer term to try to mitigate some of this. And as we've seen from previous lunch and learns, climate change has a potential to make flood events more frequent. So it's not a shrinking problem; it's probably a growing problem. So yeah, the various parties got together. So Environment Agency is kind of the lead agency on this one, but then also Rochdale Borough Council as a local authority. They also started to assemble some monies from central government, Department for Transport, and I think one other department as well. And Network Rail also were keen to get involved with the project because the flooding was also impacting the railway in the area as well, and they wanted some resolution on that. So as kind of funders, it was quite a complex funding picture. We got several funders involved, and that brought its own complexity in terms of how the project was managed. The overall scheme is about 56 million, and it's going to run for about 10 years. So the bit that Tony and I are going to describe today is really just one segment of that. It's just an element of that bigger 56 million pound, very long-term project. This is a website, the Flood Hub. So if you wanted to learn a bit more about the wider scheme, they update this every month and tell you a bit about what's going on. So it's quite a good web page on the Flood Hub. So yeah, the kind of nub of the problem, I guess. So let's kind of go to basics. This is kind of roughly what a kind of storm event might look like, a typical storm event. It's idealized, but it kind of gives you the idea. So the blue bars is your rainfall event. So you're probably going to get some build up to some kind of peak, and then it'll drop back off again. You might get a couple of peak rainfalls, but you're going to get some kind of storm event with a significant amount of rainfall. And on the left-hand y-axis, that's your precipitation. The x-axis is time, and then this right-hand y-axis is the amount of flow in the river. So you could plot one of these red lines for any point in the river for that flood event. So after your rainfalls come down, you then basically at some point behind that will get a peak discharge in your river, which is basically the worst point of your flooding. And the higher the peak, basically, in simple terms, the worse the flooding. So as you can see, a lag time. So there will be some kind of lag time, and it depends whereabouts in the basin you are as to what that lag time will be. And then after a while, those flood waters will then start to diminish, and the flood event will start to go back down again. And really, what you're trying to do is, I guess there's several options, but I guess two kind of main options. You either build your flood defences higher to try to match that peak. So the higher the peak, the higher your flood defences need to go. So you could build higher bunds or higher walls, but that's pretty expensive and in some cases nearly impossible in town centres. Or you can try to flatten that curve. So you try to basically say the amount of rainfall you're going to get is fixed. You can't really affect that, but you can try and slow the flow down a little bit so that instead of getting a sharp peak, you kind of flatten that curve out and you bring the peak down a bit, so you kind of reduce the peak discharge going through any given point. And our stuff at Littleborough is in the latter. So basically you're trying to slow the flow down a little bit in the upper catchment. So this is where we are. So we're in the northwest of England. That's Rochdale. Manchester's kind of off to the bottom left-hand side of this wiggly river line. The River Rock is this one up to the top right-hand corner through Littleborough. And that red arrow shows where we are. We're just upstream of Littleborough town centre. And our scheme was basically forming a flood basin just upstream of Littleborough to try and get some storage of floodwaters. So as we talk about, we're gonna slow the flow down a bit, store some water temporarily as the floodwaters rise, and then it will gradually let those waters go over time. So you're basically going to hopefully flatten that peak out and reduce the amount of flooding downstream. The water's flowing from the right-hand side to the left-hand side of the page. And then as you can see, Rochdale's downstream of there. So anything that we do upstream is only going to help. Yeah, project was unusual. It wasn't our typical kind of project. We had quite a complex arrangement. As I said, there were many stakeholders. So we have this ultimate client, I guess, of the EA, who are going to be the people who take operational control of the flood asset. But then we've also got Network Rail involved because our works are involving the operational railway. So we kind of have an immediate client and then an end client. And then, as per usual for Network Rail projects, kind of what I call RAM, asset management and asset management approval, or I think it's more accurately called the PRE team nowadays. But the asset management team still need to be involved and still need to be engaged and need to go through approvals. So you've got all the normal kind of railway approvals, but then a second set of approvals associated with the Environment Agency. For the designer, we engaged Arcadis, and they did both our civils and track designs. And the Environment Agency had their own designer, which I'll come on to in a minute. So the scope of our works was basically to build a large new conveyance culvert under the existing railway tracks at Littleborough. And this was going to provide conveyance. So I'm going to come on to a slide in a minute where I show you the storage and the two flood basins. And this new structure was going to basically be a balancing culvert to make sure those two flood basins didn't reach different flood levels. So it's a kind of balancing conveyance culvert. And the Reservoir Act 1975 applies now. That might seem a bit of a random fact, but that becomes quite important, as I'll kind of outline in future slides. So this is just a kind of pictorial representation of what I've just said there. So there's Murphy's on the left-hand side in the green box, and then our immediate client for this one was Network Rail. We brought in design support from Arcadis for the permanent works, and then we also brought in some specialist groundwater support as well, for reasons which I'll come on to. And then sitting up onto the right-hand side of the page, we've got the Environment Agency. We've actually got two different kind of parts of the Environment Agency. We've got the project management division, and then in addition to that, they also have separate licensing teams. which will become important. Again, I'll come on to that. And then, as I said, we've basically got this Reservoirs Act requirement. So on the right-hand side, this introduces this additional party, which is a statutory reservoir engineer, and that was brought in through Jacobs, and they're kind of almost completely independent of everybody else, and have to provide an assurance role to make sure that things are being done in the right way. Environment Agency then have their own designer and their own contractor just to make things even more complicated. So it gets pretty complex, and we needed to integrate. That's why that dotted line's there. So we needed to integrate with Volker Stebbins, EA's contractor. This is some of Volker Stebbins' work on site. So they basically built a load of kind of enabling works for us. So this is a new access structure. It's quite substantial. On the left-hand side there, that's a piling frame to put a new sheet pile abutments for this bridge that you can see on the right-hand side of the picture. So there was a main A road running close to the site, but we had to cross a river to get into the site. So they built us this rather nice new bridge to get us into the site, which in itself was quite a substantial piece of temporary works, and that's going to be in for a number of years, servicing the site to provide access. So good job from the guys at Volker Stebbins. Then on to our works then. So we'll start on the right-hand side of the page. So that's a plan view of this new culvert. It's around 45 metres in length, so quite a significant length structure. The railway is the two black lines. It's not electrified up and down lines of the MVN2 line. Some housing to the north, and then to the right and to the left is going to be these new flood storage basins, which they're going to create to basically store the floodwaters. The blue line that you can see, the blue kind of shaded area, that's Greenvale Brook, which is one of the two watercourses running past the area, and that eventually drops into the River Rock. The River Rock runs just off the left-hand side of that picture there, Gale West. So two flood storage basins either side of the railway, Gale East and Gale West as they call it, and then this new substantial conveyancing culvert, which effectively becomes, in a flood condition, becomes part of a reservoir. And we're going to form it from around 45 number segmental precast concrete units, each about, I think, around the 25-ton mark in weight, quite substantial pieces of concrete. Yeah, so in the left, the bottom picture is a cross section through the length of the culvert. The kind of pink purple shaded areas, that's going to be future EA works. So we put the culvert through, and then the EA were going to come behind us and build some new flood storage bunds and headwall arrangement. So even when we'd finished our works, there's quite a bit of additional works to come on the back of that. As you can see, it's quite tight in terms of ballast depth. They were trying to keep that structure as kind of high up as they could. So Tony will kind of take you through some of the track challenges associated with trying to make all that fit. So yeah, quite a substantial piece of work. Yeah, so just dropping back onto this Reservoir Act and why it makes a difference. So as I said, we've got to have this separate standalone individual, the reservoir engineer. Reservoirs get particular attention because of the catastrophic risk. I guess that kind of makes sense. If a reservoir starts failing, then you could be into some very significant problems indeed. So there's a piece of legislation which says you've got to appoint this completely independent person who's going to oversee everything that you do, and they've got to sign off that asset to say basically it's fit for use. There's a register of approved reservoir engineers for the UK. I think there's about, I don't know, I guess when I looked at it, there's probably about 100 or so names on that list. So it's not a massive pool of people. And you've got to keep those people engaged throughout the design and construction process to make sure that they're happy. And it's just worth mentioning, there was an event, Tobruk Reservoir incident occurred in August 2019. Some of you may remember that at Whaley Bridge near the Peak District. The spillway of that dam started to become scoured by the water, started to break up to the extent that they were really seriously concerned about the integrity of that dam and that the whole dam could fail. It's probably the closest we've come to a reservoir dam collapse in a long time. They actually did evacuate 1,500 residents. There's some nice pictures if you go online, if you've not seen it or can't remember it. They actually brought in RAF Chinook helicopters who dropped ton bags into the breach to prevent the collapse, and that was successful. And they reckon around 400 tons worth of material was dropped into position to stop that dam failing. The fire service, I mean, you can have a look at the pumping arrangements, some of the pictures online, but it is some pumping operation that they undertook, and they pumped continuously for 5 days to reduce the reservoir level by 8 meters. And if you can imagine the kind of volume involved in a reservoir, reducing it, a reservoir level by 8 meters is not an insignificant amount of water. You're talking millions and millions of liters. So yeah, that kind of, I guess, put additional kind of focus, maybe refocus people's attention on this kind of reservoir risk. Okay. So yeah, next on to the kind of groundwater. So before we started, we had a bit of a walkout, and as you can see, these are the pictures from the initial walkout. The slightly orange colour is because of historic mining area in the activity. It's not necessarily kind of pollution at the locality. It's a historic thing, which kind of colours the water. The left-hand picture, that's not a pumped water. That is a borehole that's been dropped into the ground, and that is water spilling out the top of the borehole. So that's what they call artesian conditions. So that is the water is at pressure at depth, and it's just making its own way up naturally at quite significant volumes. A bit like the only kind of way to compare it, I guess, is like when you see these old films, American Western films, and they drill for oil, and then you see all the oil kind of spitting out of its own accord, and that's the pressure underneath the ground, where it's just basically emanating out of the ground. So we're sitting in a valley here, and basically the water is at pressure at depth. So it's basically the groundwater is pretty much at ground level. Our culvert had to go around 4 meters down into the ground, so we knew as soon as we started digging we were going to create significant issues for ourselves in terms of the groundwater. So we had to come up with a solution to that. So we immediately started to get into, right, what can we do to basically sort this groundwater problem in order to construct the culvert? And we started thinking about dewatering, and these are dewatering wells. So this is a kind of cross section through the ground. The different colours are the different geological layers in the ground. The really problematic one is the kind of dark green, which is gravels. They are very highly permeable. So basically you pump continuously to try to bring the groundwater level down, but the groundwater will only come down at the rate that the ground allows you to, if you like. So if it's very, very highly permeable, the water will just keep flowing through it. So that gravel was a particularly challenging layer, which you can see around the 7 or 8 meters below ground level. We had to do a pump test. So basically, before we did any kind of design or site works, we basically had to test what kind of drawdowns we were getting. So we got out there. That had its own challenges in terms of landowners and getting permissions to do that, but we managed to get one done. And that then kind of proves your design parameters for pumping that water. In the end, the design was 53 number abstraction wells, around 10 meters deep, so quite a significant pumping. And then additionally, you have to measure the drawdown to ensure that the response is as you predict. So this is just a plan view of the site. Again, the purple lines there are the up and down mains of the railway. Ideally, the dewatering contractor would have liked to just gone straight across the lines at 90 degrees to the lines to basically create a cutoff. They couldn't do that because we had to keep the railway operational throughout, so you can't start drilling in the 4-foot. So then we had to create this kind of L-shaped arrangement at each corner, and the red boxes are the pumps. So we had 4 number of pumps in total, and then we had to find suitable discharge, and obviously you have to control both the amount that you pump in, because that's regulated, and the quality of the water that you pump in as well. So we worked with the EA licensing team to get all that agreed. That took some time, but we came up with a design they'd be happy with, and they put restrictions on what we could and couldn't do. And Tony's going to tell us in a minute about how we controlled the impact of that on the railway. Yeah, quick note just in terms of if anybody is kind of going down this route for any of their projects, there is legal requirements around dewatering. You can't just turn up and have a go at it. You've got to get licenses in place, so that takes quite a long time. So just bear that in mind. You need an abstraction license, and you also need a license to discharge the water that you pump out of the ground. So you'll work with the EA to get those in place, but as I've kind of said at the bottom of that slide, just bear in mind that is not a particularly speedy process, and that takes quite a long time. And because those are legal requirements, you will be held to whatever is in those licenses and permits in terms of what you're pulling out of the ground and what you're discharging to watercourses. But once it works really well, but you just have to bear in mind some of these challenges. Yeah, just a timeline then, just to kind of give an idea of when this was done. So we first got our involvement in the scheme around March 2020, and we went through quite a few iterations of the technical scope because we were part of this much wider £56 million scheme. There was a lot of iterations on the technical requirements, what they call CRT, contract requirements technical. That was throughout 2020 and 2021. We had several iterations of that CRT document, which created a few headaches for us. Our permanent works, the main permanent works design was done around May 2020 to July 2021, and then as I said, that dewatering design took a long time. It's around 8-10 months, and that was not kind of an easy 8 or 10 months either. That was quite an intense. And then the core blockade that when we delivered the works was late October 2021. Once we'd sorted all that out, it was then a question of how we fitted everything together. So we needed a 750-ton crane to basically lift the units into place. So that's the grey box that you can see towards the centre of the page. The red area is our main site compound area. We had, as I said, best part of 50 units to lift into place. So actually getting all those delivered and laid down, that took not an insignificant amount of space. So that's all the little black boxes that you can see. That's all the laydown areas for all of the units. We had quite a big dig to do, so we had quite a big spoil area. We then had all the materials associated with the track works. So we had a big ballast stockpile, type 1 stockpile, which Tony will tell us a bit more about in a minute. And then we also needed a secondary access to the eastern side of the railway. So we had to put that green area on the right-hand side of the page is our secondary access, so that we had access to both sides of the railway. So what started off as what we thought was quite a decent size site in terms of we had a good big grassed area to lay down. Actually, we quickly realised that it was going to become a bit of a jigsaw puzzle to fit it all in. So yeah, it was quite an intense site in the end. And then getting obviously all the dewatering and pumps, and then we had to figure out how to route the discharge for the pumps, which again created its own set of problems, but that's for another day. Once we sorted all that out, we came on to the issue of settlement. So as perhaps some of us know from our academic studies, if you start dewatering, then you then potentially start inducing settlement into the ground. So the top left-hand picture, the blue line is the drawdown profile for the groundwater. So that's where we had to pull the groundwater down to do our excavation. The black dotted line there is the excavation that we're going to be doing to basically put the new culvert under the track. And immediately then, obviously, Network Rail started asking questions about how we were going to control the settlement on the track. We generally have to commence dewatering around 2 to 3 weeks before we're actually going to do any excavation. So we had around a 3-week period where we'd have the railway line running operationally, and we had to control any settlement on the railway during that period. It was at full line speed. There was no TSRs in place, so we had to basically maintain track geometry to 75 miles an hour. We then started to get into Cat 3 checks. Network Rail said, right, do a Cat 3 check. So we went away and got that done by a completely independent third party, and that's a Plaxis model in the top right-hand corner of the ground settlement. To basically try and get some accuracy into that, and with the reds showing the greater settlement and the blues the smaller settlement. And then that spat out basically a kind of minimum, most likely a maximum track settlement. Just before I hand over to Tony, I think the one thing we learned on this is calculating the overall settlement seemed to be a lot more straightforward than the rate of settlement. So the rate of settlement seemed to be very tricky to kind of nail down. They kind of seemed to be able to come up with this figure reasonably quickly, but then the rate of settlement seemed to be very difficult. I think it probably was on the boundaries of kind of academic published literature. So yeah, we then started to get into the fun of that. So perhaps at that point, Tony, if I'm all right, I'll perhaps let you take up the story. more of an expert on track than I am. Thank you.
Thanks, Stu. If you're driving, will you?
Yeah, just shout. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yep. So as Stu's just said, then the settlement period was really difficult to pin down. You saw on that previous slide we had quite a high upper limit of potential settlement in the order of about 28 mil, I think it was, going down as low as sort of 6-7 mil on the bottom ends. It was, yeah, that's it. Thanks, Stu. So it's really difficult. There's a huge range of potential settlement values there, and in terms of what that means for the track geometry, it could either be very little or it could be, you know, bordering close the line type settlement issues. As we mentioned, with the wells being in the granular layer in the sands and gravels, we'd anticipated there'd be quite a quick effect of the dewatering initially. All that gravel and sand would permit the water to pass through it quite easily. We'd pull a lot of water out quite quick. But as you saw before, and as you can sort of make out on those two diagrams to the side, it was overlain by clay. And with clay being cohesive, it'll take a lot longer for the water to permeate through that, drop down into the gravel and be taken up by the wells. So we had these two distinct stages of dewatering. We'd expect something quite quickly, and then that'd slow down and it'd be more gradual. So we had to develop an asset monitoring regime for the track that'd be made up of two different regimes, really. So during the initial granular layer dewatering, we were monitoring the track 3 times a day, which was quite demanding. And then once that initial drawdown slowed, and we'd be happy that we dewatered that granular layer, and we were now into the slower clay material, we dropped that down to twice a day, and that carried on until the track was removed as part of the core works. And one thing to note is that, you know, if we had seen any of these huge settlements that were potentially possible, we would need to access the track and lift and park or do whatever we needed to do to restore geometry and keep trains running. So we did have access secured throughout the dewatering period so that we could do that. Next slide, please, Stu. Just a little bit about the track design. What we had at site, 70 mile an hour twin track. The downline was concrete sleepers, 756 rail, whereas the upline was the same 756 rail, but was on steel sleepers. There was no overhead line, no third rail, anything like that. So on the face of it, quite simple from a track point of view. The one thing we did add to the north of the site in the small picture, and you can just about make it out by the red dotted line at the top of the design, we had a footbridge, a footpath. And vertically, we were quite limited by this. We didn't have a lot of headroom. And as Stuart mentioned earlier, we had these considerably sized concrete culvert units to put under the track. So the track was kind of threading the eye of the needle between these two limiting structures. Our design sort of worked out. We had around about 30 mil in terms of lift and slew required to implement. So fairly straightforward. Slide, please, Stuart. The main challenge that I had from a track point of view on this one was the culvert itself. We've got a cross section of the design sort of central to the picture, and around that we've got the actual sort of conditions from site, so you can see how that benched excavation looked in practice, and you can also see the concrete units coming through in comparison to the little excavator in there, so you can sort of see the scale of it. We're talking about quite a large rigid structure being introduced into the track bed, which is normally fairly forgiving. So from the track point of view, we had to manage that stiffness differential. We didn't want to create a rough spot in the track that would affect ride quality. Yep. So next slide, please, Stu. Just to complicate matters as well, these aren't the greatest photos. These are from the dilapidation walk taken at night. But you can make out that we've got very poor existing ballast conditions. Probably something to take away. This was documented quite early. It was noted out that whilst we'd be renewing the ballast throughout our works, throughout the excavated area, we'd be tying into this existing poor condition either side. So was a good chance that the design we'd implemented might not hold up outside of the renewal extent. Next slide, please. So how we overcame this. We've got the plan to the top of the screen and a cross section to the bottom. You can see that we had compliant ballast depth. We had compliant ballast depth for both the steel and the concrete, and we also had provision for the steels to be upgraded to concrete in the future and maintain a compliant ballast profile under that. One thing that we did introduce in between the concrete culvert and the ballasted railway was an underballast mat. I think that was something that I'd first come across via the PWI, either through a seminar or a session such as this. So it kind of reinforces the value of these. And I think I've seen Andy, one of the participants today, who sort of introduced me to this. It was 18 mil rubber ballast mat. The primary function of that was to sort of cushion the impact of the ballast against the structure. So it's not only protecting the culvert itself, but also sort of reducing that hard spot in the track and sort of maximizing ballast life as a result. The geogrid that you can see in the photograph from site on the left hand side there, that ran throughout the extent of the excavation from the bottom of ramp to bottom of ramp. The purpose of that is to reduce ballast spread, ballast settlement by interlocking the granular material below the track. And as I've said, ballast ramps either side. It's a 70-mile-an-hour line, so we had almost 12 meters worth of ballast ramps where the excavation is graded back out to the existing. So you haven't got a bit of a step effect. You've got that smooth. Well, the idea is you have that smooth transition through the renewal. Next slide, please, Stu. So, as we've seen from those designs, we needed quite a bit of track to be removed. We needed to take out enough railway to be able to install the culvert and have that working room around for the excavators, the benched excavation. But in order to minimise the disruption by these works, we also had to keep that as small as possible. We had these two sort of contrasting drivers there, and also when you take rail out, in terms of making sure it goes back in quite quickly, you want to keep your welds to a minimum. There's a couple of challenges on this scheme. We had less than ideal weld positions in terms of where the culvert was going to end up, so we had to move some of those. And also, there's quite a limited access window. While the railway was under possession for the week, we could only work outside of the rail limits for the first 5 days of that, because there was works going on elsewhere and engineering trains were going backwards and forwards. So in effect, we only had the long weekend to remove and reinstate the rail. So the picture on site to the left hand side, you could probably just make out the H piles. That was temporary works to support the cables as the trough and everything would have to be removed. The culvert was going to be installed left to right across that screen as we look at it now. So yeah, that's just illustrating the cut points we'd done on site. So we knew exactly where we were cutting in, exactly where the welds were going to end up. Next slide, please, Stu. When it comes to taking the track out, we'd made the decision to go with the McCulloch panel lifters. There was obviously, you can make out the crane in the back there, significant piece of lifting equipment, more than capable of doing this. But there was a risk. There's always a risk when using a large crane of the wind being winded off if the wind speed's too high. I think that the tolerance for this, and Stu may know off the top of his head, he may not, but I can't remember. It was fairly low. There was quite a low cutoff where we could get winded off, and we went with these panel lifters instead. When we'd rationalised that track out down as much as possible, it was a 43 metre track panel, which represented just over 21 tonne in the case of the concrete. I think we've got the 3 lifters there that were more than capable of doing it. I think at the time, this represented the largest lift that was done. I know they've since gone on to do bigger lifts on the back of it, but it saves us an hour versus our programme, versus what we anticipated to do. Got us off to a really good start. We took the 2 track panels away from us as we're looking at the picture and stored them there for the duration of work.
Tony, sorry to interrupt. Can I just make sure everybody's muted, please? Can everybody mute, because there's a bit of interference there with the talk that Tony was giving. Thank you.
No,
Brian.
no, they've already got them, Alex. They've already got them.
Next slide, please, Stu.
They have these. All they need to do is issue them to us, basically, and be involved in the configuration. So
I think that bit of noise might be at my end, Stu.
However,
is it a person someone next to you?
Yeah.
All
Did
right.
you want to take over for a couple
Yeah,
of
I'll
slides?
take it. I can wrap up. Yeah.
All right, sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
So yeah, this is the kind of installation going in. So as you can see, these are the 25-ton units being lifted into position. So this is on the 9-day core blockade. This is a good shot. Just shows, as Tony mentioned before, the wind speed. We're right near the top of the Pennine, so the Pennine moors are just in the background there, as you can just see at the very top of the picture. So we really were in the thick of it in terms of wind speeds. And I remember standing right down near the crane. It didn't feel that windy, but the anemometer, if I said that correctly, I can never say that word, at the very top of the crane jib was still picking up quite significant wind speeds. So it's just due to the altitude, really. Yeah, very cramped site. That kind of illustrates kind of how tight it is. So as I said, we started off with what we thought was quite a large site, but it ended up being used almost to its full capacity. And this is the culvert's nearly in at that stage. You can just see the tamper just lurking in the background there, waiting to do his tamping. There's another shot a bit closer in. So as you can see, it's quite a busy site. The header pipes of the dewatering are what you can see in the kind of L-shaped in each of the corners. That looks like, I think it's like the ballast mat going on top or the geotextile, one of the two. And yeah, this is kind of getting towards the end now, just ready for the track to go back. These are the culverts in place, ballast is back, and we are tamping. We lost about 4 hours in the end due to the wind. And I wouldn't say the winds were horrific, but it just goes to show in that part of the world just how sensitive it can be, really. And this is quite a good slide. So this is the culverts in. Obviously, the head walls are still to be built at a future date. So this is at the point of handover to the Environment Agency, where they're then going to take the site over and build head walls and flood bunds and all sorts of stuff. But that just shows you where the groundwater's rebounded. And as you can see, it's nearly just to the underside of the culvert soffits, which just goes to show that the dewatering did its job in the main construction phase, which is good. Just round off with some transferable learning. So Tony and I kind of had a bit of sit down, and we were thinking, not all of you will have projects in, completely like this, but what are some of the kind of transferable learning points that we could pass on? It kind of came down to 4 biggies. I think on the specialist advice. So for us on this particular project, it was the dewatering, and we needed a very specialist skill set. So I learned a lot through this. It's an interesting kind of subset of the industry, which I didn't really know a lot about, but there's a fantastic amount of knowledge and experience in there, which we were able to tap into, which is great. So I kind of said on other railway projects, it might be something like, interlocking or power feeding, whatever it might be, just, I think sometimes in the past I've struggled on with projects where you've thought, well, actually in retrospect, we should have got a bit more specialist advice a bit earlier on, and we kind of suffered because of it. Yeah, for the obviously we've tried to bring out the multi-stakeholder aspect of this. I think if anybody's got projects like these that have many stakeholders involved and potentially funded by multiple parties, you're going to have to get a program that reflects that. So technical approvals are going to be complex. There's no getting away from that. You're going to need a lot of talk, a lot of discussion, a lot of integration. So you just need the time to do that. And we thought we had quite a bit of time, and it transpired that, we were still having conversations with the reservoir engineer 4 or 5 days before the blockade. So it just goes to show that, you just need that time in the program. Yeah, obviously we've brought out the water theme, I think, in this one. Water is at the heart of so many construction issues. And we just put, if we'd end up aborting that blockade because of the groundwater, then the cost would have been absolutely huge. So you do need to kind of get your water management right. And then finally, yeah, just be very aware of technical changes. I didn't really go into it massively today, but we did have a number of CRT changes as we progressed through the design. That did create us some significant issues. So you just have to take, when you are getting technical change, you just need to take a deep breath and just think, what are the impacts and the implications? Because it could really, if you play that down the line in terms of the program, that could really start to bring on some real pressures and challenges in terms of delivery. So I think it's just having that breathing space to say, right, what is the implication here and what do we need to think about, rather than kind of just cracking on, hoping for the best and trying to be optimistic about it. So that's kind of, I think I'll stop sharing at that point. Brian, I guess if we've got any questions, more than happy to kind of take them, or if there's something we've not really explained as well as we could, then we'll have another go.
Yeah, there's well, I've got a question for you straight away that comes from Craig Wilkinson, who says, what levels of settlement were recorded when dewatering started ahead of your core works? And he's assuming that they didn't reach the calculated values.
Yeah, hi Craig, good question. Tony might correct me out. Yes, they didn't reach the calculated values. You're right. I think in the end we were in the region of about 7 to 8 millimeters recorded settlement. But Tony, you'll probably remember better than me.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. We weren't even anywhere near the most probable prediction. Although the rate was sort of as we'd thought it would be. I think we did race quite quickly over the first few days to that sort of 8-9 millimeters, and it kind of just topped out at that and sat there throughout until we took the track out. So yeah, it was somewhere between least and most probable. It was nowhere near the maximum, fortunately. But
one of the ones where you've got to almost be conservative, though, haven't you?
Yeah. Because you don't want it to be,
Yeah, because we only had really intervention opportunities on Saturday nights leading up to the main blockade. It was almost, I think the nervousness in the client organisation was that if we did get to the point of having to intervene and go in and pack the track, it's when would we do that? So I think there was some nervousness around, you can't just be pulling, a card on us saying, right, we need access straight away. So it's that thing of trying to be a little bit conservative, but then trying to be realistic. Yeah, it's quite a hard balance to get, really.
There's another question here from Richard Oliver, actually, on similar, and it's a good question because did the dewatering lead to track faults? And if so, were the steel sleepers able to adequately be packed by manual means? And also, did the water rebound create any track top alignment issues? Because you had two types of sleepers, didn't you?
Yeah, we did. So the answer to the first part is no. We didn't have any intervention level faults ahead of the core work, which was good. Although we had sort of planned for the worst, and we did have this response strategy in place. In terms of the rebound, that was actually something we did discuss in advance. We did ask the question whether we could expect, once the dewatering went off, that there would be any uplift. And the feedback was that no, this wouldn't happen. I think historically there'd been lower water levels than what we were taking it down to. So there was no problems anticipated with that, and indeed we didn't experience any.
And what sort of monitoring did you have on the job for the track?
It was manual track monitoring. We had the retro targets fitted at 3 meter centers, read with a total station. And yeah, we had sufficient engineering on cover on site to be able to manage that throughout. It was quite intense, particularly when we were monitoring it 3 times a day. But we had sufficient cover on site, and we did manage that. I think it was preferable in many ways to some of the automatic stuff, because you just get a better feel in terms of like laterally and vertically what's going on with the track. And also, if you need to focus in on any particular area to repeat your readings, we had that ability to do that on site. So
yeah. Can I just go back to one question I've got, and it's pretty basic, and I may have missed it in the start there. So you've put in a new culvert And presumably there's a new reservoir being built. Is that what you were saying as well there? And this is all to hold the water back and stop the actual flow being at the peak it was before. Is that that reservoir next to the track? Yeah,
that's right. So basically, in the future, so they'll create a flood storage area both to the east and the west sides of the track. So they'll have two basins. So in a flood event, those two basins will fill up, and the railway effectively is on a slight embankment through that, so it'll pass through the middle. So you'll basically have a railway with a huge lake either side of it in a flood event. So yes, but that work is ongoing. So at the moment it's just a grassed area, but there's a lot of work to be done to basically excavate out those flood basins. They'll have to build new flood bunds to basically bound the site, and then there's obviously head walls to go on that culvert, etc. So that's several years worth of work to create all of those kind of impounding structures, which will be on site probably at the moment or in the next few years. And then, yes, as you say, most of the time it'll just sit there, dry, grassed area, and then in a flood event, once the river levels get to a certain level, they'll start to fill that basin, and it'll continue filling until such time as the flood event starts to subside, and then it will start to progressively empty again. So it kind of becomes a holding pond, or two holding ponds either side of the railway.
And what we were talking about actually before we started today is that we can expect water's going to have more of an impact on the railway. And so this type of scheme that you're doing there with collaboration with I suppose third party to the Environment Agency, we need to be able to do more of that, don't we?
We do, I think so. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things the EA project team were kind of quite interested in was how they do those sorts of collaborative projects in the future. They're not necessarily the most straightforward, as we kind of talked about with some of the consenting, but even just like the funding and the stakeholder management. So they were very interested to see how it worked. And I must admit, it was, I think like all things, it depends on collaboration, doesn't it? And it depends on how we work together and how we kind of cross some of these boundaries between organisations. And it was very good. I must admit, the EA were very proactive. They were very keen to hear our challenges and listen to what some of our issues were as much as some of their issues. So yeah, I'm kind of fairly optimistic about work like this in the future. It's just, I think, as you say, Brian, I think we're going to see more of it working across, local authority kind of divisions, EA, Network Rail, because these flood events, they don't just impact one or two people, they impact whole communities. So therefore, inevitably, you're into this multi-stakeholder, multi-party engagement approach, and it's not easy. It's not easy, as Tony and I.
You've paved the way there, though, because you've had to go through it to the start. Then it's interesting what you put at the end there with the sort of lessons learned and things you can take home, because that will be invaluable when you get involved in other ones as well. Yeah. So we've got another question coming through. I don't know, Richard, do you want to say it out loud, or do you want to type it in? I'll leave it up to you.
I'll say it out loud then, Brian. Thank you. Will the EA own the culvert eventually and the ongoing maintenance? I'm just thinking those trash screens, who's going to be responsible for keeping those clear in flood events when the reservoirs are in place?
That's a good question. I think so. The ownership of the actual structure is Network Rail, because I think they basically had a policy. It went back to the client organisation, in the RAM teams, and they basically said if it's a structure under the railway, we want to own it. So the fabric of the culvert is theirs. However, the wider flood management maintenance is done by the EA. They manage all flood structures, if you like.
Okay.
I think the trash screens in the end got designed out. I'm trying to cast my mind back. I think the debate was saying they'll create more problems than they'll solve. So I think they just omitted them. But yes, the answer to who will manage the flood event will be the EA. But Network Rail wanted to retain ownership of the concrete structure, I guess, perhaps because they wanted to, because it supports the railway, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Any more questions there on this? Because it's a fascinating topic, this one, and you've, you know, I don't think I've seen many other where you had to work with so closely with the Environment Agency recently, and I think it's going to be a growing area. That's it's really good, really good. Anybody else got a question they'd like to ask before we close it down? And you can finish your lunch.
Everybody's keen to get on with their afternoon.
Yeah, yeah. Have you? When did it get completed?
So we did ours in October 2021. Was when and then we handed it back December 2021. But as I said, I think Volker Stevin are going for another 6 years.
Yeah.
So obviously there'll be a stage completion to various parts of it, but it's not just Littleborough they're working at. They're working at multiple locations. So that work is ongoing and will be ongoing for many years. I think I popped back to see them maybe last year, and they're in full swing. Like so, yeah. So the EA and the Volker Stevins of this world will be going at that for a long time. But from our point of view, we wrapped
so
up.
The people
December.
of Rochdale have got to wait quite a bit longer to actually avoid, and you know, if another storm comes, they could be hit again. I
think what you get though is you do get incremental improvements. So as they because there is multiple elements to that wider £56 million scheme, each of those mini schemes, if you like, will bring benefit. But yes, to get the full benefit of the whole 56 million quid, you will have to wait till it's fully done, which will probably be another 5 years. So they're very, very big jobs. But to be fair to the EA, they have a lot of, you know, there's a lot of landowner, you know, consents, even land purchase. So it's not, they've got the work cut out for them to get through all that.
Yeah. Last call for questions. Okay, I'd really like to thank Stuart and Tony on behalf of the PWI and all the people joining today, because I think it's been a fascinating subject and very well put together, and explains to us the issues in that area, and it could be repeated in other areas as well. And we need to learn not just about working on track, but actually at the end of the day, a lot of it's to avoid the damage to the track. So, and it's going to be outside the railway, the catchment areas for a lot of this type of thing. So fascinating subject. I know we can't get everybody to clap, but I'm sure you can raise hands or do whatever. It might even be a clapping thing there. I don't know. But please, if you could raise your hand. Oh, there you go. There's a clap one that you can use. Oh, Sarah's using it. That's really good. And Richard's got it as well. Okay, everybody. We will we'll just stay on a couple of minutes here until we close down. But if you wanted to stay and ask a personal question, feel free. And because Tony and Stuart will just stay a few minutes if you don't mind, and then we'll get Sarah back, and then we'll shut down. But thank you very much for that. It was great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.